In order to spread self-determination, the US attempted to dictate the future of Vietnam for its own political gain. Terrorism was stopped through destabilizing an entire region and plummeting a country into anarchy. Russia and its neighbors were liberated by their complete economic collapse. The whole world was liberated and civilized by colonialism. Just like fear-mongering about China today, the West hated the Soviet Union because it didn't want to submit to US hegemony, because it was another way of life, because it determined for itself where it wanted to go, because it funded decolonization movements in the Third World. The West hates China because it's opposition. The West hated the USSR because it's opposition. The West has never tolerated dissent, not workers during the Gilded Age, not colonial resistance today. The USSR, on the other hand, was a normal country with faults and successes. Civilization did not need to be brought to Russia and Eastern Europe. China does not need your freedom and democracy, nor did Vietnam, nor did Iraq and Afghanistan, nor does Palestine. The USSR did not kill millions in Nazi-style death camps, and it was not a crime that Stalin didn't immediately invade Germany to stop fascism and prevent World War II. It was not a crime that the USSR tried to defend itself and pragmatically survive. Taking Eastern Europe wasn't the second Holocaust. Stalin did not take a comically big spoon and eat all the grain and bribe all the clouds to stop raining. To be semi-academic, since this video is kind of different from my other works that you have not seen and do not care about, here is that outline. I began with disputing some common perceptions about the USSR, totalitarianism, censorship, Berlin Wall, and the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact. There is a section providing some historical background/context here. I then move on to attacking the West and how it cooperates with fascism. After that, I mention the successes and failures of the USSR with some cautious comparisons to the US. The video concludes with some comments about the legacy of capitalism. In the post-conclusion segment, I talk about how capitalism creates culture like the attitude around socialism and the USSR. As the famous line among leftist circle goes, quote, "The brutal totalitarian regime was actually a giant trough from which many took whatever they could," unquote. Parenti referred to many examples of how people took advantage of the inefficiencies of the system. Under capitalism, in contrast, taking too long of a bathroom break would get you fired. Yurchek, a liberal who apparently claims to be humanizing the USSR, writes, quote, "Required Kosovo meetings were often reported without actually being held. The Komsorg, the meeting's convener, would often suggest, maybe we should just write down that we had a discussion and voted in favor of the resolution without actually having the discussion. I understand that everyone has things to attend to at home," unquote. Sorry for the pronunciation. People in the totalitarian state regularly slacked off. The state and ideology, according to the Western conception, was all-powerful. Yurchek writes, "In a seemingly paradoxical twist, the immutable and predictable aspects of state socialism and its creative and unpredictable possibilities became mutually constitutive," unquote. The West likes to depict Russians and most civilians under socialist states as mindless barbarians. Hell, even today, China is sometimes depicted as this absolute dictatorship. American conservatives are actually far more controlled than any socialist citizen. The so-called communist dictatorship of the early days of USSR, where no one was allowed to think any opposing thoughts, was described by anti-communist historian J.R. Getty like this, quote, "The struggles over economic planning, treatment of the opposition, and the balance of power within the territorial party apparatuses were separate problems in the early 1930s. Political leaders argued over the rate of economic growth, the status of the opposition, and how to reform the regional party networks. Additionally, there was an ongoing tug of war between the center and the provinces over patronage and fulfillment of decisions. The Communist Party, far from having penetrated every corner of Russian life, was more an undisciplined and disorganized force," unquote. 47. The early Central Committee couldn't even keep track of who was actually in the party. Sometimes petty criminals would join. And the purges of that time period were a result of it being so disorganized and focused on surviving the Civil War. By the end of the war, the party had corrupt officials, people that didn't actually do anything, whites who sneaked their way in, and petty bourgeois individuals. It seems harsh to punish wealthy peasants, but people were literally starving. It's pretty hard to follow ideals in a war-torn country. This organizing and cleaning up of the party was chaotic and separate. It was not intentionally or specifically used to suppress dissent. Only a small percentage of the purges was actual power consolidation. Clearly, control under the Soviet state comes nowhere near control under liberal democracies. 38. The USSR was founded from the decaying corpse of a feudalist aristocracy. It survived 2 world wars, a civil war spearheaded by capitalist imperialists, and a Cold War where it had to spend tons on the military instead of on welfare and economic development. 39. Stalin tried to avoid the Cold War because the USSR was in no position to compete with the West. Quote, but even after this mutual declaration of the Cold War, Stalin still hoped to avert a complete split with the West and keep the door open to negotiations and compromise, unquote. In contrast, the US began with millions of slaves. It gained resources and land through genociding Native Americans, and it was the most well-off after World War II. And yet, Americans still compare a country that was founded less than 30 years ago at the time of the Cold War, which also survived the most horrific war in modern history, to a country an ocean away from the carnage in Europe who industrialized fucking decades before the USSR. It's an absolute miracle that the USSR reached the heights that it did, propelling humanity into the space age in 35 years. A majority of which was filled with war. The Bolshevik Revolution was just one of many socialist movements in 20th century Europe, and like other movements, the capitalist class tried to strangle it in its crib. Socialist movements after World War II were also suppressed. You can read Chapter 1 of Divisions of Labor by Looney E. Carley to understand this period of socialist history, how World War I affected it, the reformists versus revolutionaries versus anarchists, workers as internationals, and unification efforts. The author in page 19 suggests that communist opposition to the Social Democrats, quote, set the stage for Hitler's dictatorship, unquote, but that's misdirection. It was in fact the failure of the Social Democrats that allowed for fascism. The historical background of socialism's struggle for its very survival against the oppressive forces of capital is conveniently left out to perpetuate archaic Cold War anti-communist propaganda. And such propaganda continues to be more effective and more totalitarian than anything done by the Soviets. Quote, the idea that censorship is a contingent external accident to speech emerged not from disinterested speculation but from a centuries-long battle waged by intellectuals beginning in the Enlightenment to remove themselves from the tutelage of authority, unquote. Liberals have one definition of censorship. All other definitions are censored. When liberals critique censorship under socialism, what is actually being done is the production of capitalist culture. Their critique says that 1. Capitalism has no censorship, 2. Socialism censors because it's evil and socialist, and 3. Which relates to 1. Censorship can only come from authority. These are, in my opinion, the main assumptions among various other liberal bullshit. Though no doubt Soviet censorship was wholly unjustified in many cases, this does not then mean communism has the explicit aim to control information. If the evil commies really wanted to pacify its populace, it would have tried to keep a majority of people stupid. Quote, however, the demand for education cannot be satisfied because the Tsarist government deliberately restrained cultural development. In the beginning of the 20th century, only about 22% of Russians were literate. By 1939, the USSR literacy rate had reached 81.2%, unquote. In contrast, as of 2024, only 79% of Americans are literate. 2024, by the way. More powerful than any state censorship is poverty. Liberals do not actually care about freedom of speech or any other so-called human right. Such rights only apply when it benefits their system of power. Quote, these forms of censorship involve private actors whose interactions within civil society are conceived as purely voluntary and thus free of illegitimate cohesion, unquote. The free market is divine truth. Censorship is precisely perceived as whatever diverts from that truth, whatever is immoral, outside of the liberal ideology. 40. Suppressing communism is just common sense. It's only censorship when it's the communists that are doing it. Capitalism controls information for profit. Socialism does it for survival. Socialist organizations face constant attempts by capitalism at overthrow and infiltration. Black Panthers and the Russian Civil War are just some of the more famous examples. On the other hand, capitalism surveils your online information, cracks down on protesters and minorities, establishes a surveillance state after 9/11 just for more profit. More money going to the billionaires and politicians. But because it's for the free market and US security, it's a good thing, I guess. But the USSR? Now that's the real surveillance police state. Never mind, the USSR had nowhere near the technology of surveillance that the US has today, and yet no statements about the US being more totalitarian than the USSR ever was. A Lithuanian describes his experience in the Soviet Republic. Quote, that name is grateful for the opportunity to experience life in two different political systems. We felt economically but not politically safe living the socialist system, not only waiting in lines for basic food or household items. We were never afraid of losing our jobs. Now we have to compete and prove our value. Still, he adds, while no system is perfect, having freedom is better, unquote. Precisely if the West has colorful consumerism, then they are more free. If they have a choice between a genocide supporter and a fascist, then they are more free. If they can choose between this blue thing made from child labor and this green thing made from child labor, then they are more free. A Soviet citizen would criticize their own society while a Westerner would usually praise theirs. But the totalitarian one is apparently the former. The premise for this belief is that, quote, the collapse of Soviet socialism was predicated on this badness and immorality of the system, unquote. The US need not send police to your door. It need not censor as much as the USSR because you are already stupefied and pacified. Actually, no, it does censor more than USSR. I don't know why I wrote that. I mean, do you see any socialist voices today? Of course you don't. Like, do you see any socialist governments in Latin America? Guess why? Because fucking CIA. What is indoctrinated into the Western mind is the Berlin Wall, evidently showing Eastern totalitarianism because America has never reinforced its borders before, nor had it ever had concentration camps for immigrants. The Berlin Wall is the ideal propaganda material. What is constructed is not a wall of pragmatic use, but an abstract capitalist reality. The wall does not reinforce borders, it reinforces capital. Let us take a new perspective on the wall beyond Western propaganda. 1. This was the Cold War. Harsh measures had to be taken. A reinforced border also prevents spies. 2. The West was far more developed and much less damaged by World War II. Well, I mean, I'm not talking about Western Europe, I'm talking about the US. Obviously, it'd be more attractive and people would want to immigrate. It's like when people compare Cuba, a small island nation, to the US, a global superpower. 3. It wasn't as if the East was a desolate wasteland. Socialist countries provided a lot of welfare, and for citizens to just up and leave after being provided housing, education, healthcare, etc. is a massive economic loss, especially for a recovering republic in the Soviet bloc. Now, on the East-West German divide and whose quote-unquote fault it was, there's debate about the so-called Stalin Notes, which proposed negotiations for a unified neutral Germany. The Wikipedia article on this is actually not that bad, go and read it. The West did not consider unifying Germany because they wanted more influence and control. In my opinion, a neutral Germany would have been better for the East, considering how the West has most of the power. This article, which is on the side of the West, first of all, it explains how the note was not by Stalin, mind you, says that the note was not genuine negotiation and was rather directed at the German people, specifically the left. I argue the West should have been more open to negotiations instead of completely antagonizing communism, and even if the note wasn't genuine, good, fucking good. It was good that the Eastern government tried to inspire the people for a unified Germany. The West clearly did not want to negotiate. I mean, they went on to split Korea and then Vietnam for God's sakes. The issue of German divide is also an example of how Westerners automatically view the East as the sole aggressors. It's all the fault of communism and the West has no play in the matter. The evil commies always scheming because of their totalitarian nature. Certainly the USSR and its republics weren't perfect, see Hakim, but it wasn't cartoonishly evil. An American tourist in East Berlin describes it as so. Quote, I remember buying an alleged cola at lunch that was pale amber color, tasted like water, and cost about 10 cents. Perfect metaphor for life in the East, as far as I know. Cheap, but still not worth it. I do recall the pastries were actually tasty though, unquote. Life was simply dull. The most oppression these tourists found in the East was a train official assuming that they were spies just because they were from the West. He quickly realized how stupid that was. Some more on tourism in socialist countries, a tourist guide writes, quote, though Yugoslavs could not become really rich through hard work, it was possible to attain modest wealth and buy a snazzy car, a vacation home, Western imports and other niceties, unquote. Similarly, near the end of the USSR and its republics, the people were disillusioned. They wanted more consumer products, not heavy industry. The Molotov-Ribbentrop pact functions similarly to the Berlin Wall. The pact is not a result of politics, but a representation of evil, of Eastern decadence. Reality does not exist, things don't happen, instead are simulations and farce, media and culture war. Quote, image now seems to be the whole point of political discussion. It is not the issues we're asked to judge, it is the nuances of the presentation, unquote. Anything to further capital and make everything else mere illusion. Somehow within the deluded fantasies of Western minds, capitalist cooperation with fascism that continues to this day is far less significant than a single pact of convenience in World War II. Quote, the French government had been particularly eager to avoid fighting Hitler and proposed engaging Stalin instead, unquote. The West loved Hitler until he turned his violence on them instead of the leftists. Quote, the USSR and especially its Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Maxim Maximovich Livanov, offered collective security or an anti-Nazi alliance to France and Great Britain. Paradoxically, Stalin's blood-drenched wickedness did not mean that Soviet foreign policy was wicked also. But in France and Great Britain, the determination to resist fascism was sapped by a hatred of Bolshevism, fear of socialist revolution, and sneaking admiration for Hitler's repression of the left, unquote. Even with all the fervorous anti-communist language, the facts are laid bare. France and Britain rejected an anti-Nazi alliance because they hated socialism. And so Stalin basically said, fuck it, why not take some land so Hitler can have it and prepare for Hitler's inevitable invasion using the new buffer land and using the peace provided from the Pact 41. You can argue that it was unjust for the USSR to take Eastern Europe, but the alternative was, during World War II, fascism, and then post-World War II, capitalism. Ideally, there would be no invasion, but this was World War II and the Cold War.
Carlyle
Implies on page 21 of Divisions of Labor that the USSR did not adequately fight fascism. In my opinion, the USSR was more pragmatic than ideological, and pragmatically, it was the West's job to stop fascism, since it was also their fucking fault in the first place. Let us now look at how the West cooperated with fascism. The US supported Pol Pot and fascist Latin American regimes. For the sake of profit, Europe enslaved entire countries and exploited their resources. And today it allows fascist anti-immigrant parties to rise so it doesn't have to deal with the consequences of its imperialism. The US uses the third world for cheap labor. It placed military bases in every corner of the globe. It funds Israel, vetoed any pro-Palestinian resolution in the UN. Corporations funded and governments were passive to Hitler's rise, as well as other fascists like Franco, 42, etc., etc. Tell me again who's the fascist, the Soviet Union or the West? Winston Churchill would rather side with the fascists than let the commies take over in Greece near the end of World War II. Quote, 28 civilians, mostly young boys and girls, were killed and hundreds injured. We had all thought that it would be a demonstration like any other.
Patrikios
recalled, Winston Churchill considered the influence of the Communist Party within the resistance movement he had backed throughout the war, the National Liberation Front, EAM, to have grown stronger than he had calculated, sufficient to jeopardize his plan to return the Greek king to power and keep communism at bay. So he switched allegiances to back the supporters of Hitler, unquote. It is unclear if the British themselves shot at the demonstrators, but Churchill's position is as naked as a colonialist maniac can be. Quote, ultimately, the telegram ended with the stern message, we have to hold and dominate Athens. It would be a great thing for you to succeed in this without bloodshed if possible, but with bloodshed if necessary, unquote. Even the American press was against the British fuck. Quote, additionally, the portrayal of the communists as sympathetic freedom fighters in the press handicapped Great Britain's ability to call upon the United States for aid, unquote. More damningly than British colonialism being British colonialism is the fact that American corporations did business with the Nazis, and after they were gone, corporations then proceeded to do business in apartheid South Africa. And none of this is to even mention the infamous Operation Paperclip or any of these names. Who cares how many people are disappeared in US-backed Latin American regimes, how many Palestinians are run over by bulldozers and their children exploded into pieces, as long as the money keeps fucking flowing. Capitalism was and still is deeply in love with fascism. As Stalin put it, quote, the Germans are great people, very good technicians and organizers, good, naturally brave soldiers. But we must bear in mind that our allies will try to save the Germans, the Nazis, and come to an arrangement with them. We will be merciless towards the Nazis, but our allies will treat them with kid gloves. Thus, we Slavs must be prepared, unquote. The evil Stalinist regime could have never imagined committing atrocities to the extent of the Western world. It did not intentionally cause famines, 43, like the British during the Bengal famine, has never colonized half the globe for centuries. This article tries to equate US neocolonialism to Soviet passivity during Khrushchev on the question of French colonies in North Africa. Quote, similarly to the United States, the Soviet Union sought to reconcile two contradictory objectives by appeasing the colonial power and comforting the nationalist movement seeking to overthrow it, unquote. Quote, in order to achieve this goal of hegemony, they both favored France's presence to that of their perceived enemy, unquote. Because the USSR wanted good relations with France, that's apparently the same as the US sending guns and bombs to the French to kill Algerian civilians. The article, however, admits, quote, the Soviet Union succeeded in gaining the friendship of Algerian nationalists in spite of its détente with France. The Soviet success was due to the material, moral, and diplomatic support it provided the nationalists, unquote. Sure, I would have preferred that the Soviets acted like the Chinese, viciously advocating for armed anti-colonial struggle. However, it had to consider European politics. Deteriorating French-American relations and improving French-Soviet relations was their priority. But if the French public turned in favor of decolonization, the Soviets would have gladly supported that. And independent Algeria would have been great for the Soviets because the West colonized the world. They hold all the power. Any power not held by them is good for the Soviets. The Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andrei Gromyko, even said this at the UN, quote, as the atrocities of the Hitlerians could not make France either German or semi-German, neither could all the crimes and actions aimed at crushing the Algerian people's struggle for national liberation make Algeria French or semi-French, unquote. The USSR was not the one that colonized the world. We're just in a world that's colonized. And they didn't do neocolonialism where, sure, regions get independence, but their economics, resources, and politics still belong to the West. Not once did the USSR have a war as bad as Vietnam, as never openly committed genocide like the West over and over and over again. If you think poverty and famine amounts to genocide, then the West still outranks the Soviets by millions or billions as we see corporations and the government continue to exploit third world brown people. The USSR actually did a lot of great things. Unlike the West, it at least attempted to promote minorities. Quote, Bolshevik ideology was adapted to take on board the project of fostering cultural and linguistic nationalism among the nationalities and ethnic groups of the USSR, while at the same time struggling for the class-based political unity of all Soviet peoples, unquote. Before I mention stuff about welfare and space technology, let me expand on that. Edward Podolsky writes in Some Achievements of Soviet Medical Research, quote, the state encourages the search for new medical facts and techniques, and the men who achieve results are honored as national heroes, unquote. Reconstructive surgery repairs the functions and appearances of parts of the body, healthy skin transported from other parts of the body to repair damage, a new throat transported from dead body to a woman over the course of months, a new technique to straighten out the spine, innovations in blood transfusions, easier and less painful childbirth. Those are just some medical advancements. Feudal Russia had little to no urban centers and the people frequently faced epidemics. Millions upon millions were uneducated, impoverished, and disease-ridden. Sewage systems were only present in just 5% of cities by the 1900s, 44. However, in the midst of another war by the imperialist West, killing millions, the Soviets began to set up public health centers to fight the widespread disease. The government mainly focused on preventative care through medical supervision and educating the peasants on hygiene while distributing supplies. Cuba also focuses on prevention because curing disease is a lot more costly, and with the embargo, Cuba is basically a third world country and yet somehow still better healthcare than the fucking US. Housing was a priority in the USSR. Quote, the Soviet Union tackled at breakneck speed a severe housing problem inherited from Tsarism, a problem compounded by the devastation of the War of Intervention and later by World War II, unquote. While corporations buy up houses as an investment, as hundreds of thousands are left homeless, the sole priority of the Soviet Union was to house people, because it wasn't concerned with profit. Housing the people benefits everyone. It just made basic fucking sense that the state should try and solve crises. But under capitalism, corporations profit off crises, healthcare, housing, shortages of any kind, the well-being of the nation as a whole be damned, as long as the CEOs get a higher paycheck. Quote, now, almost 30 years later, the majority of urban families live in modern apartments of their own, a significant improvement, unquote. After World War II, the homeless and buildings destroyed numbered in millions. This was the situation the USSR faced while constructing estimated millions of apartments. Liberals love to complain about the greatness of those apartments and how rushed the construction was and thus how low the quality was, but this article still admits that, quote, communist countries succeeded in providing nearly free housing for all workers. Rents were set at 5% of income. In the UK today, we spend 26% of our income on rent. Citizens were provided with brand new dwellings with central heating, hot water, and electricity, which was unusual for the USSR at the time, unquote. Unusual. Let me state this again. 4 to 5 decades ago, they lived in actual feudalism. 3 decades ago, they faced a brutal civil war. 1 decade ago, Hitler was reducing their homes to rubble. So yeah, it was fucking unusual that they suddenly got modern apartment buildings. Women's rights in the USSR is a popular topic. Quote, in order to assure women's active participation in production, the additional costs such measures necessitate pregnancy productions, paid leave to take care of sick children, etc., are borne by the full society, unquote. Quote, the fact that women began to gain parity in engineering during the 1970s is especially important because a degree in engineering is almost a prerequisite for the achievement to positions of responsibility in Soviet industry, unquote. Has the US heavily advanced women's rights? No. Women had to actively fight for their rights. Has the US provided its citizens with healthcare, housing, and a basic standard of living? No. Hundreds of thousands are still homeless, 47 million food insecure, including 14 million children. Has the US contributed to decolonization? No, it claimed to be freeing the Philippines from Spain, but it has occupied it, 45. It continued to fund the last vestiges of settler colonialism in the Middle East. It uses IMF loans to continue exploiting the third world. Whatever bad thing you think the USSR did, the crucial fact is that it was in the context of the Cold War or any other struggle for its survival. The US, on the other hand, continues to commit atrocities, continues to abuse its citizens during peacetime in the 21st century. However, I'm not here to cherry pick. I'm sure the US had some episodes where it wasn't genocidal, like, no, not during the founding, Civil War. After Civil War, blacks were still oppressed. The Gilded Age, horrible for workers. Progressive era was a bunch of liberal bullshit. It was the workers that actually doing all the work. World War I and World War II, corporations actively funded the enemy, and the Allies also committed a ton of atrocities. Yeah, so what if I'm openly biased? Who cares if some white Americans got a good standard of living? Ask the black people during any period of American prosperity if they feel prosperous, or the Native Americans, or the Hispanics. Sure, slavery is gone. Sure, queer people are more accepted, but that is despite the government and capitalism. Would you mention good things about a country that committed genocide and proceeded to support more genocide? Evidently not. Liberals would never mention anything good about the USSR. Let us now talk about some flaws of the Soviet Union. The worst of Soviet crimes was the banning of religion. This ban only gave more ammunition to the capitalists. The early socialists recognized religion was used to promote conservatism, but can just as well be used to promote progressive ideas. Parenti also has some critiques in Black Shirts and Reds. There is a lot of faults I mentioned before, like arbitrary censorship, overemphasis on heavy industry, the disorganized and chaotic early days of the Union, and obviously Stalin did some terrible stuff I need not mention. However, he was not Hitler 2.0, nor did he have absolute control. That's a cartoonish caricature of how the USSR functioned. Analyze Stalin, 46, as a leader of a country, not a divine supernatural force from the deepest realms of hell. Anyway, Afghanistan, 47, Eastern Bloc interventions were not comparable to Western imperialism. The CIA did far worse with far less reason. Black market, this is also not comparable to billionaires and American politicians. Bureaucrats skimming off the top are not billionaires owning an entire economic system. And this is more niche and obscure, but Stalin, what the fuck, man? Why did you support the Chinese nationalists? Communists are spreading too fast and it's gonna anger the US and make them intervene in China? Damn right it's gonna anger the US. 48. According to Morton, in housing in the Soviet Union, though he idiotically compares the USSR to the US, as was the norm, and he implies some unrealistic expectations of the USSR, he assesses that rural populations and people on the outskirts didn't have housing as good as urban populations. Migration from rural to urban areas was limited due to a lack of housing, but obviously there was a black market for this, causing as well a lack of laborers in the urban centers. Housing was also not prioritized during Stalin after World War II, when the country was in desperate need of rebuilding. Soviet women's rights were obviously not perfect. Quote, "The problem lies in a lack of any corresponding change in the social perception of men's roles." Unquote. One of the more stupid Soviet mistakes was the stubborn bureaucracy rejecting advances in computing, resulting in major inefficiencies. But perhaps the worst failure of the USSR is its inability to defend itself against capitalism. Cuba, though embargoed and weak, is still at least alive. Socialism must be able to preserve itself, with the state and soldiers, with unions and cooperatives, with community and mass support, with socialist propaganda and socialist artists and intellectuals, with good leadership and organization, what have you. The USSR survived the Civil War, but couldn't survive Gorbachev and the new generation sentiments. That's tragic. So was the USSR a utopia? Of course not. In the early days, it was absolutely horrible to live in. Wars and famine plagued the country. Sometimes famines were a result of Soviet mismanagement, other times Western imperialism. During the middle and the end, life was rigid, boring, and bureaucratic. Or at least that's what my sources tell me. I don't really know. The USSR did things because of pragmatic and materialistic reasons with a side of ideology. Women's rights, for example, made sense because more workers. The justified criticisms of the former Soviet Union, however, did not justify bringing neoliberalism to the Republic. Today, the result of that romanticization of liberalism is oligarchy and economic collapse. Is Putin really better than the bureaucracy of the former republic? Or will liberals claim that somehow shock therapy went wrong? Some far-right bigots even resort to saying that Russia is, and I'm not joking, still somehow secretly communist, to desperately try and keep their pro-capitalist worldview intact. The USSR served as a counterbalance to Western hegemony. If it was still here today, the Israeli genocide would either be not as bad or non-existent. Iraq would be as well. But the West has absolutely no opposition, so it can get away with atrocity after atrocity. Like colonial times, it once again has a monopoly on power. Maybe the USSR did do some unforgivable things in your opinion, but by all accounts, if you look at the evidence, it was still better than capitalism. And at the very extreme minimum, the USSR, being the role of a counterbalance, limited Western power, albeit the West still could commit genocides. Quote, Churchill would later realize the EAM's more sinister goal of transforming Greece into a communist state with a totalitarian liquidation of all political opponents, unquote. Anytime a socialist organization gains power, they're labeled as dictatorships. Stalin had a cult of personality while George Washington was objectively great. Propaganda films like The Men Who Built America gladly glorified Gilded Age monopolists, but if a socialist had power anywhere close to the level of the bourgeoisie, they would be seen as worse than Hitler. The monopolists are glorified in the show as driving the economy forward, but Stalin's industrialization was ruthless. Even the rightful praise of Stalin's fight against the Nazis is apparently a cult of personality. Quote, during the war, the Soviet Union, the Red Army, and Stalin's leadership had received exemplary and laudatory coverage in the Western press. Indeed, the Stalin cult in the USSR had branches in Britain, the United States, and other countries of the Allied camp. Unquote. Churchill was literally a white supremacist and colonialist, and yet he's remembered as the one who fought Hitler. Where's the cult of personality for Churchill? If the human race has any integrity at all, in time capitalism and colonialism will be viewed as bad as we view monarchies today, as bad as we view the Nazis. Capitalism birthed some of the worst and most brutal empires in history. It was a period of rampant barbarism that went alongside progress, just as medieval times. Kings displayed the scaffold of torture, but there were agricultural innovations. Industrialists exploited millions and billions, but there were scientific innovations and rising quality of life. The US alone oppressed and killed millions, or resulted in the killing or oppression of millions in Vietnam, Iraq, Palestine, Latin and Central America, Cambodia, Laos, Libya, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Korea, Japan, Philippines, Indonesia, Afghanistan, Iran, South Africa, the DRC, Syria, Haiti, Cuba, Russia and Eastern Europe, North America itself, and that's not even the whole list. The US genocidal regime continues to this day. While they redirect anger towards socialism, they continue their mass slaughter and enslavement. As the beginning of the book, On Necrocapitalism, a Plague Journal, put it, quote, workhouses filled with bodies laboring to death, and the streets glutted with the starving poor. Wars and environmental devastation, and then beyond that, 2 world wars, the first a squabble between imperialist nations. Regimes were overthrown, dictators friendly to capitalism installed, and all resistance murdered and disappeared, assassinated, mass murdered, hunted down like dogs, starved and tortured, thrown out of helicopters. Apartheid, forced assimilation, death squads, famine and disease, wars on drugs, terror or the poor. Unquote. What would you have done if you were alive during Nazi Germany? If you're an American, you would have stayed in your home, kept quiet and followed every order of the state. Hell, you might have even been an enthusiastic supporter of Hitler. And for everyone else, especially the Palestinians, they would have been the many minorities and socialists in the camps. The American conservative and liberal would indeed cheer on American foreign policy, however genocidal or imperialist it may be, as long as they, the white first worlders, benefit domestically. The Democrats are the Himmlers to Hitler. When Congress stood up to applaud Netanyahu, that will not become history. No, rather it will be forever alive in current politics. Because as long as capitalism survives, Hitler will as well. The conservative and the fascist share this in common, the control and romanticization of the past. As Big Show analyzed in his video, the conservative ascribe their beliefs to a universal, utopian order, a common sense, a normal and standardized reality. They feel oppressed precisely because this reality has never existed and will never exist. History is kept alive through the artificial capitalist lens we view it through. In this way, history loses all its qualities and becomes yet another means to an end. And yet, the conservative is the most pluralistic of all. They are, at least, far more diverse than the liberals. It is only when conservatism takes its fascist form does it fully convert into hegemony. In the end, the conservative is really just in the world they can't understand nor cope with, adapt to. It doesn't matter what the so-called truth is, they just need an answer. They just need to express themselves as alienated capitalist subjects. And again, as Big Joe analyzed, comedy is one such way they do this, using comedy as a mere excuse to say their opinions, their disillusionment. Comedy to them is not an art form. Likewise, politics is utilized as spectacle. The world is not understood through these mediums. The medium defines the world. It needs to. It has to. Capital is external to ideology itself. Everything it does is already moral, already realified, as in capitalist realism. It does not blast the destiny of society from state speakers, hold parades to demonstrate the concreteness of that destiny. The capitalist reality exists as itself, as the unspoken symbolic order, upholding all that is civil, annihilating all that is obscene. No protest may oppose it. No voice may reveal it, no action may destroy it. It is pure ideology, pure cynicism, and pure reality. The pluralism of the conservative is always artificially flattened into whatever is within the limits of capital. Capital does not justify its existence before the people. You justify yours before capital. It is seen in its eyes, in its institutions, its processes of production and simulation, a reflection of oneself, and thus petrifies the subject as such. For to act against that reflection, against your own ingrained capitalism, is to act against yourself. A conservative must not reveal where their reality and thought derives, committing self-harm by throwing themselves into a cruel and incomprehensible world, by facing a Lacanian real, a dramatic truth, and the institution disguised as a human soul, as autonomous and as the cultural soul of society itself. The students are thereby delayed in the realization of the fact that capital is not all-seeing, and our capitalistic reflection is not really ourselves but a construct of said system, because it is precisely presented in totalitarian manner the necessity and goodness of education. 49. Quote, does not the threat of an atomic catastrophe which could wipe out the human race also serve to protect the very forces which perpetrate this danger? Unquote. So opens the introduction to the first edition of One-Dimensional Man. There's always a country threatening American values imperialized, from the artificial political world of anti-communism or some other threats like terrorism. The other forms of control are solidified. Comfort is created so that no matter what, we can always say communism is evil, the Western way of life is validated. Only communism has mechanisms of control. Capitalist exploitation is projected onto the ideology. Same goes for Iraq under Saddam, North Korea, China, Russia. It's all projections of Western totalitarianism on much weaker countries. Effectively then, nothing else exists. Only capitalist exploitation and projections of it. History and politics become mere projection, a manipulatable simulation of experience, of knowledge, without actually having to interact with actual knowledge. The world is obscured. The USSR is propagandized through capitalistic media and cultural production. It is a commodity fetishism. We accept the final product of the world as is. Enlightenment has succeeded. Its rational functions turn both the material and metaphysical world into one giant commodity. It is, of course, not the history of the USSR people are concerned with, but rather the reproduction of American culture of the present. MLK is used by both conservatives and liberals alike to further their own ends. The issue of racism is individualized and not related to systemic and economic injustices. Protests are idealized as peaceful so the protesters can be denounced when they defend themselves against the savage police. Socialism is restricted to the status of the social democrat, not to inch further like Bernie Sanders, but to impose a limit. Once workers would call for the complete overthrow of Gilded Age monopolists, now popping a billionaire healthcare CEO in the back is only for the people with nothing left. It is easy to continue consuming, easy to believe the USSR was evil, easy to politically engage only within the acceptable boundaries. No new thing surprises the system. It's all expected or scientifically categorized. As the comedian Big Show analyzed, Roseanne Barr claimed, "The world is rotten," and that's all it is. There's no greater explanation, no analysis to be had, no, it's just rotten. And the right, the far right, is the dying voice of an unrotten past. We should have taught our children better, she claims. You should see some of her past performances. There's no eerie silence from the audience, no desperate yelling about vague politics as if she was talking to no one. If conservatism reveals the truth of liberalism, Barr reveals the truth of conservatism. Because in the audience, there is no one listening. We must first understand that everyone wants material change. In America, Republicans are the only ones advocating for change, alongside bigotry, of course, while the Democrats are being as centrist as ever. Let us not forget Marx in our pessimism. Material analysis is what is most important. I believe the communist message has the potential to be heard more times than any conservative message, if done correctly. You can't really decry socialism when the socialist is talking about giving you labor protections, redirecting taxpayer funding from wars and corporations to healthcare and housing, from prisons to actual efforts to support communities and reduce poverty and crime instead of funding the violent police. I think the socialists that are passive simply haven't read enough theory, don't understand Marxism nor its history, only being able to recognize that billionaires and US imperialism is pretty bad. The narrative around socialism is then able to be taken advantage of, creating a void where there was once a horizon. Instead of analyzing and improving material circumstances, today's first world socialists are Marxists in ideas only. As Parenti analyzed inventing reality, the media serves to pacify the masses, simplifying issues and making a spectacle out of politics. It is natural that people are stupid. It is natural they don't understand Soviet history or socialist resistance. It's simply more comfortable to continue listening and watching. It is therefore also natural to purely focus on the idea of the USSR and Marxism instead of its application. Instead of organizing to help the homeless, provide food, and advocate around specific and immediate material issues, the revolution will be built not by a single leader and a miraculous uprising without prior efforts, but by the towns and villages, by the friend groups, families, and social spaces, the unions, cooperatives, and political organizations as a whole. I recognize how damaged all those spaces are for socialist advocacy, but we have nothing else. Let the world be consumed by media, who tell you endlessly that it is the only medium of communication. The revolution will not be televised, will not be live streamed. So that's the segue into my section on capitalistic media. You have to watch my 3-hour video essay for that. However, I have an extra section for anarchism just for this video. I'm a philosophy guy, so I sympathize with anarchists' means justifying ends mentality. Philosophy is about production. If you're not producing, then you're not living socialism. You're not a laborer at all. In spirit, anarchism is correct about this. But then they turn in the liberal direction. Revolution is only successful if you follow ideals, they say. Watching anarchist YouTubers, I notice that all they talk about is theory. The movements they do talk about are insignificant. Meanwhile, the USSR succeeded in bringing millions of peasants out of poverty. You may be living a philosophically honest life by being an anarchist, but at what cost? Philosophy is once again reduced to thinking really hard in a dark, damp room. Reality is once again projected. Simply, anarchists are liberals who cannot live with capitalism. They want the ideals of enlightenment to be realized fully and truly, but perhaps history exists, and the evidence shows the benefits of state socialism, specifically in a capitalistic world. Philosophy is not about ideals. It is not about optimism. It is not about making the absolutely correct choices, about living the better world. No, philosophy is about producing in the here and now with absolute context to the present and past. There is no future, and we can only create a past. We must produce, not as individuals striving for ideals for an imaginary audience inside of our heads, but for the actual people in the world. History will erode your ideals, and they will not glisten in heaven. Nation states are what we have, and it is what we must work with. That does not mean we retreat from our radicalism. Rather, it means the realization of said radicalism. No one uncritically supports the USSR. No one is restrained in their ideals by their attempt to protect state socialism. No ideals are compromised. They're just not projected onto the world and made absolute. Anarchism is Marxist in ideas only, and thus it does not produce, it does not create, it does not lift millions out of poverty. Camus famously did not support colonial resistance. While Sartre was a communist, he did not even engage in criticizing the USSR at the time because it would have subverted the communist movement at home. He criticized the USSR later. I'm not saying anarchists are Camusians, but the logic is there, isn't it? Rebellion without real regard to reality.
Papa, you tend to be lacking vision. I marvel how we avenge it. Split it with the opinions, divided by our position, suspicious of our condition. Even though people killing it, lying to get commission. Cause you can live with somebody and never know their intention. These politicians be selling my people that science fiction. I'm guided by my conviction. They think it's a contradiction. I bleed on my composition. My flow is an epidemic. You might need a paramedic as soon as you try and listen. I'm giving you niggas crack. Spitting at Richard Nixon. I'm blacker than expedition. Driven by presidential security team defenses. I'm changing your supposition. Nah, wait, I'm correcting your corrective lenses, knocking those down off the hinges. Forget the public interest, I don't follow trends, I invent them.
Knocking those down off the hinges.